The news has described the Long Island serial killer as a demon walking among us. Well, we're going to talk about him on today's Charlie Crimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those solely of individuals interviewed and participating in this show and do not represent those of Peacemaker Network and Charlie Crimebuster. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to the podcast today. We're going to be talking about, the blockbuster news this past week that they had arrested the Long Island serial killer. It's Rex Heuermann. He's a demon that walks among us. He's a predator who ruined families. That's what Suffolk County Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison said during last Friday's press conference. And then he went on to say, if it were not for the members of the task force, well, he would still be free today. We're going to tell you all about that on today's podcast. But first of all, let me take a moment to welcome you as new listeners to the podcast. Every week we have new listeners, and we are very thankful for each and every one of you. We always invite you to reach out with a shout-out. You can reach me, Charlie Crimebuster, at gmail.com. That's Charlie Crimebuster, gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Just reach out with a shout-out. You may have questions, might have suggestions about other programs, or you may even want to disagree. As we always say, it's a safe zone, so just reach out with that shout-out, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the program, let me encourage you to go over to peacemakernetwork.com. That's peacemakernetwork.com. There, you can become a badge, BADGE supporter. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us as we help law enforcement, first responders, and the military. Read all about that over there at peacemakernetwork.com. Again, we're thrilled to have you on board the Charlie Crimebuster crime train, as today we discuss the killings, the serial killings, there at Gilgo Beach. That's what they were first called. And by the way, if you'd like to get caught up on other programs, just go over to charliecrimebuster.com. You're going to find a whole bunch of episodes where you can just listen to the previous podcasts that we had. All right, now to our main focus. The Gilgo Beach serial killings, were a series of murders. But by the way, let me say at the very beginning of this program, we do sometimes get tongue-tangled. It's really called tongue-tangled, if you know what I mean. And we don't do a whole lot of editing on our program. We like for it to be real and transparent, so you're going to hear some of the hiccups, some of the mistakes as we go along in the program. I hope that just makes it more real to you as you listen. Well, they were first called, the Gilgo Beach serial killings. It was a series of murders. I guess it was between 1996 and 2011. During that time, they actually found the remains of over 18 people there at Gilgo Beach. That's actually located on the south shore of Long Island. Now, most of the known victims were sex workers who often advertised on Craigslist. And so the perpetrator of the case, he's known as a couple of different names. Of course, the most famous is the Long Island serial killer. It was also abbreviated as Lisk, L-I-S-K. He was also called the Maynardville Butcher and the Craigslist Ripper. Now, these remains, again, was found over a period of months from 2010 to 2011. But it really came up after the disappearance of a young lady by the name of Shannon Gilbert. That disappearance resulted in a police search there along the Ocean Parkway. And that was near the remote beach towns, of Gilgo, thus the Gilgo killings, and also Oak Beach there in Suffolk County. Now, the remains of 4 of the victims was designated as the Gilgo 4. And what's interesting about that was that they were found within a quarter of a mile of each other near Gilgo Beach in December 2010. And there was 6 more sets of remains that was found in March and April of 2011 in Suffolk and Nassau counties. Now, police believe that the latter sets of the remains, they actually think that that was even done before. It actually predates the 4 bodies found in December 2010. So, it's really no telling how many people can really be attributed to the Long Island serial killer. Now, the one who started it all, Shannon Gilbert, her remains was actually found a year after the remains of the Gilgo 4. And her death does cause, well, some people contest it. Some actually say, the police are saying it's an accidental drowning. But an independent autopsy would determine that this was a strangulation as well. Probably another victim. Now, there was also someone who was arrested about this case earlier. We're going to tell you all about that in just a moment. But first, we got to remember our crazy crook story. So let's take a quick break from this dark reporting and share with you today Charlie Crimebuster's crazy crook story of the week. Our crazy crook story today comes from Maryland, Suitland, Maryland, actually. And Maryland police, well, they're searching now for what they've dubbed the Bad Luck Bandit. That's right, the Bad Luck Bandit. He was hit in the head by a brick that he threw at the store window. Yep, Prince George's County Police Department, well, they said on Monday that there was a man caught on surveillance footage, well, breaking into a restaurant last month with a brick. They went on to say that the man shattered the store's front window, walked in, then tried to use the same brick to break what turned out to be a bulletproof glass. Well, police went on to say that the man repeatedly tried to break the window protecting the front counter, and then on the third try, well, the brick, well, it actually bounced back and hit the dumb crook in the head. And there he fell down and kind of had to shake it off. Well, I guess there's real truth to it. You got to watch out when you do crime because it will bounce back to get you. And that's exactly what this brick did. Hit the suspect in the head. So our crazy crook story of the week, yep, it's the Bad Luck Bandit who used a brick to break a glass, tried to use it to break through bulletproof glass, only to hit himself in the head. This indeed is Charlie Crimebuster's crazy crook of the week. Now back to our main focus. At the very beginning, it was apparent that the bodies that were found were linked to a serial killer. Some episodes back, I shared with you about how, as investigators, we often look at victimology. And in looking at that, you can certainly see similarities in the way that these bodies was found there near the ocean side. All of the bodies, well, they were found in the same area. I told you about the possible Idaho, or rather Oregon killers some time ago when we thought that there might be a serial killer in Oregon. You can go back to Charlie Crimebuster to read all about that, and listen all about that, rather. Well, we talked to you about that. There were similarities about how the Oregon murders took place and how it was described within a geographical area. Well, the Long Island bodies, well, they were even closer in a geographical area. And they were all similar in the way they looked. Their appearances was similar, all petite. And there were things, the way that, well, about the way that they were killed, that again was similar. And of course, many of these were working in the same business, sex workers. And they advertised in the same way on Craigslist, which is why the killer was dubbed the Craigslist Killer as well. And many of the bodies were wrapped in burlap sacks. Now, not the typical type, but these were camouflaged ones, like the way hunters sometimes use when they're hunting, to camouflage it. Now, these similarities and more, well, they alerted authorities of the fact that they had a serial killer on the loose. But earlier investigations in this particular serial killer, well, they led to loose ends with no arrest. However, they did have one suspect some time back. He was a carpenter by the name of John. I'm not even going to tell you his last name because he wasn't the one that did this. But he had killed others, and they thought at first that he was their man. They even used the fact that he was a carpenter that led him to believe that was the reason why the mutilated bodies was cut with such precision. Hey, hold on to that fact. You're going to see that again. You will see that in the coming arrests. But this man, John, well, he wasn't the Long Island serial killer. So with this lull in the investigation, this investigation coming to a kind of a cold area in the investigation, it was stalled out. What really brought it to the conclusion that police this week announced the arrest of the suspect? Well, this is an amazing story of an incredible investigation. An incredible investigation that brought this alleged killer to an arrest. And just as it was true with the investigation of the Idaho College killer, well, two things stand out. One, the investigators cooperated with the other agencies. And number two, they kept it secret. They kept it quiet as they worked on the investigation. Now, it was not always true that this investigation was cooperative, though. In fact, it was back on December the 10th in 2015. That's when Suffolk County Police Commissioner Tim Sonny, he announced that the FBI had officially joined the investigation. Now, that announcement came one day after the former police chief, James Burke, well, he was indicted for civil rights violations and conspiracy. Now, Burke, he did resign from the department back in October 2015, but he was reported to have blocked the FBI involvement in this case for years. Now, the FBI had assisted in the search for victims, but had never been a part of the investigation. By the way, that guy Burke, he was in 2016, he actually was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for assault and conspiracy. So now let's go back to our time today. There was a new task force. It was formed in February 2022. And that new task force, well, that included the work of local police, city police, local county police, the state police, and the FBI. So we have the police department, the sheriff's department, the FBI, as well as the district attorney, all of them working together on a task force. What do we say? Yep, teamwork equals dream work. Now, one thing I thought was very interesting, it was said of these investigators who have brought to the arrest of this man, well, it said that these investigators, quote, left their ego at the door, end of quote. Hey, my friend, that's an awesome statement. You see, too many investigations are hindered because of the overinflated egos of investigators. But there is something else that stands out in this investigation. Not only the fact that they work together, but they use secrecy. And in order to do that, they use the work of a grand jury. My friend, that is volumes. You see, the grand jury, you may not realize this, but the grand jury has a whole lot of power. The grand jury can subpoena records of people to assist in their investigation. And the key to it all, listen to this now, is they can do it in secrecy. Now get this. They began their part in the investigation this task force did of February 2022. And by March, just a month later, they already had their person of interest. And amazingly, for a whole year, they investigated and put this case together. And it was all kept under tabs, quietly. At least the identification of the person of interest. Well, how did it all begin? Of course, it began with the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert. And looking for her, they discovered the additional bodies and became aware that a serial killer was at large, and there could be a number of bodies attached to this alleged killer, up to 10 or more, as the investigation will continue. But how did this new task force get their sights on this alleged killer, Rex Herman? Well, it began by linking him to the thing that most of you hold in your hands most during a day. You know what that is, don't you? Yep, your cell phone. And just like it was pointed out that the Idaho State killer, the Idaho College killer, just like that was linked to the murder scene, going to and from it from his cell phone. Well, so investigators were able to link a cell phone to the alleged serial killer in Long Island. Yep, Rex Hearman. They actually served more than 300 subpoenas and search warrants and uncovered cell phone records for burner phones, up to 7 of them, that he used to arrange meetings with 3 of the Google 4 victims before they went missing. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, I thought he used burner phones. Yep, he did. Matter of fact, he did, thinking that they could not be traced back to him. However, also, foolishly, he used the victim's phone, and investigators were able to put together a triangulation of the location of the victim's phone. That led them to put together what we call kind of a geo-fence of 2 separate areas. One of those areas was within the area that the alleged murderer lived in. And the other area of the geo-fence? Yep, it was where the alleged murderer worked, where he had his own architect company there in Manhattan. Now, even though they had an immediate area at that time, there was still no suspect. There are lots of people who lived within those areas. So how did this task force zero in on the suspect of this alleged monster? Well, my friend, it was good old-fashioned police work. You see, one of his victims, Miss Costello, she was one of the 4 there that brought about this whole case to start with. Well, Miss Costello, she used a ruse on the suspect. You see, the suspect had been set up with a date with the victim, Miss Costello. Only Miss Costello scammed the suspect. You see, while he was there to meet her, well, she had her boyfriend come in, frightened the suspect off, yep, but without the suspect getting his money back. And so, after Miss Costello became missing and one of his victims, well, there were others now that was able to describe the last person that they knew that was with Miss Costello before her own disappearance. And they described that individual, now get this, as a person who was between 6'4" and 6'6", a large man, thickly built, not necessarily overly muscular, but just a naturally big person with glasses. He was white, and he had dark hair. And get this now, of great significance was the fact that he was driving a dark-colored black first-generation Chevy Avalanche. Now pay attention to what I just told you. A dark-colored black first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. Well, that vehicle, my friend, was placed in a database. Then that database was linked to vehicles found, yep, if you please, in that geo-fence that they had placed together on the victim's cell phone. He was crazy enough to use the victim's cell phone. And that database recognized that such a type of vehicle, well, it belonged to one person in that geo-fence by the name of Rex Hearman. So now they have someone they can focus on. And now they can use the grand jury to access records of the alleged killer. Now, even though the vehicle is now in South Carolina, they were able to link it to him at the time of the murders. And you know how sometimes these mistakes will haunt these murders, just like in the Idaho College Killers, where Brian Koberger left that knife sheath behind. Well, it appears that this alleged killer, that old Rex the killer, well, he used his own cell phone to look up something on his burner phone, and that enabled him to access even other records. Now, on top of that, he was now under surveillance, even to the point that he was observed going into the store and putting more minutes on another burner phone, and then his credit card. His American Express card. It was, of course, subpoenaed, and it was able to find such type of purchases. Now, we're not through talking about his phone and his media use. You see, people simply do not realize how much people can tell about you by your media footprint. I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but first, let me tell you what this psychopath and how cruel this man was. He even used the victim's phone and burner phones to taunt the victim's family. He even made one call to a victim's teenage sister. He asked her if she thought she would ever see her sister alive again, only to tell her calmly, well, that he had killed her sister and she would never see her sister alive again. Oh yes, this is a cold-blooded evil killer who deserves justice. And thanks to the hard work of the task force, he will. Because Mr. Rex the killer, well, allegedly, he used those accounts and burner phones to contact women for prostitution services, as well as making chilling, now get this, online searches. These searches included sadistic, torture-related pornography, child pornography, disturbing content. Ms. Heerman's also accused of searching, quote, why law enforcement could not trace calls made by the Long Island serial killer, and, quote, why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught? And, well, yeah, we know new phone technology now is the key to breaking this case. Speaking of his use of the media, he was following the case very closely. He made over 200 searches about the investigation, even as he was being investigated and did not know it. Here's just some of the searches that they traced. Again, why law enforcement could not trace the calls made by the Long Island serial killer. Number 2, why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught? This is what he's searching. Then Long Island serial killer update. Long Island serial killer update 2022. FBI active serial killers. And then, of course, at least 3 of the victims, Megan Waterman, Melissa Barthélemy, Maureen Barnes. Then he also searched Cops Launched Gilgo Beach Homicide Investigation Task Force. And then he searched Mapping the Long Island Murder Victims. Also, he searched Inside the Long Island Serial Killer and Gilgo Beach. Yep, he made those searches. You see, they were able also to link the victim's phone to the proximity of the killer's cell phone. Yep. Victim's phone, killer's cell phone, all in the approximate same place, near his home, near his office. So now, my friend, now that they've zeroed in on the suspect, they can now work on linking additional evidence to the suspected murder. And just as Brian Kohlberger, who we recently reported on, made a huge mistake, other than cell phone records, well, our killer made his own mistakes on him. Because one of the bodies, well, there was a belt found at the scene left behind, had the initials HM, Herbert Mary, HM. And, you know, his name is same way, Heerman's his last name. You have that HM in there. Well, he thought it was probably clever because his real initials is RH. But it does match up to his last name, doesn't it? Just like the foolish mistake of Brian Kohlberger to leave his knife sheath behind, he leaves his belt behind. And, of course, as we think about the investigation, next comes what you all have been waiting to hear from me, right? Yep, of course. Well, what about DNA? Yep, DNA. Among the evidence linking Rex the murder, well, there was a hair found on a burlap material, that burlap sack I told you about, camouflage. There was a hair found on that sack, on Megan Waterman's body. That's what court documents stated. Now, officials have been unable to conduct DNA analysis on the hair early in the investigation. But ultimately, they did submit it for further testing now in July of 2020. You see, there's modern improvement now where scientific DNA can do wonders today that it could not even do 13 years ago. So now with this precise scientific technology, they were able to match the hair to the DNA of our suspect. Which, by the way, that DNA was gathered by that old-fashioned police work surveillance. He threw out a pizza box with his own DNA on it, and they were able to link that one to one of the bodies. And remember how I mentioned that one of the early suspects, well, he was a carpenter who had access to tools to make precision cuts on the body. Well, our own arrested suspect, Rex the Killer, he happens to have a hobby of woodwork. No doubt, same type of tools. So let me just take a moment to review what we have this new task force. Number one, they were able to develop a geo map of the victim's cell phones that placed Rex, the alleged murderer, in that zone, both at his house and at his business. Number two, they were able to use an eyewitness to describe our murderer. And they were able also to tie into that a first-generation Chevy Avalanche that belonged to our alleged murderer, Rex the murderer. Number three, cell phone suspicious activity, where this murderer, Rex the murderer, used up to 7 burner phones to try to hide his tracks. Of course, if you've heard me talk very much at all, you've heard me mention the word consciousness of guilt. That you've heard from me before on the podcast. Just like old Brian Kohlberg turned his phone off when he was doing the killing. A consciousness of guilt. And so also his own searches with an obsession to this case, along with other incriminating searches on these phones. And of course, number 4, more importantly, what I think will nail the door shut on him getting away, is the critical and crucial connection to DNA that places him at the burial site with at least one of the victims. Add that to the similarities of all the other killings, and I believe we've got him. I believe we've got this demon who walked among us. This man who walked among us, a successful architect, owned his own business, a family man with children. Well, it once again alerts us to the fact that there are always serial killers among us. FBI one time reported that at least 25 working all the time in America. 25 serial killers. But this one, well, thank God now he's behind bars. And it appears he's going to remain there until his trial and beyond. Because the Suffolk County District Attorney, well, he asked the court to deny bail for Rex the killer, the alleged killer Rex, when he appeared to face the 6 murder charges. And DA went on to say, quote, based on the serious, heinous nature of these offenses, the strength of the people's case, the life incarnation of the defendant faces upon conviction, the extreme measures the defendant took to attempt to avoid apprehension for an extended period of time, and his recent sadistic child pornography searches, use of fictitious names, email, cell phone burner accounts, online counter surveillance, his access to and history of possessing firearms. Well, all of that, he said the people believe that the only means to ensure the defendant's return to court is to remand this defendant without bail. That's what the bail application stated. And so indeed, he is there without bail, and I'm pretty sure will remain there throughout the trial and forever in his lifetime. Now, Mr. Harrison also added that Rex the murderer's arrest, well, it's only the first step in the process of bringing justice to the families. And they're going to, of course, look at other things and maybe try to link him up to a whole bunch of these other bodies. Right now, he's charged with 3 of the bodies, and I believe they've got an ironclad case. Don't you? Tell me what you think about it. There you have it. Now you know how they were able to get to this guy, how they were able to find Rex, the alleged murderer, and how they were able to put him behind bars where he deserves, and he deserves a whole lot more. Again, we cannot say enough how much we need to emphasize that we need to work on keeping our loved ones safe. This is another message to all of us out there, to take care of our own loved ones and to teach them to be aware of their surroundings at all times, and to not place themselves in areas where they could be vulnerable to monsters like this man. So until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster here, reminding you, be safe, be alert. Yep, for the life you save, it may be your very own.